Hello, today we're going to have a look at the 737-800X in X-Plane 11.5. This is the ZiboMod 737, so it brings the standard 737 in X-Plane up to a much more realistic study level aircraft. So we're going to take it from cold and dark on the ground at Edwards Air Force Base in America, and we're going to get the systems up and running and go for a fly a circuit around the airbase with it. We're not going to deal with air traffic control or anything like that. This is purely going to be about the systems and the functionality. So it's a bit of a voyage of discovery for me too, because I haven't used it for a long time. So I may get caught out along the way. Hopefully we'll be able to get through it though. So without further ado, let's have a look inside. We're cold and dark at the moment. It's worth noting that I'm going to be using keyboard shortcuts to zoom around the cockpit and help me out. If you know how X-Plane works, you know how these work, so I can look at the FMC, for example. I can look at the overhead panels, I can go and look at the tablet. It just helps me navigate quickly as I'm talking. Okay, the first thing we're going to need to do to get an aeroplane up and going is go and turn the battery on. So we turn this switch on up here and close the guard on it, and that gets us some power. We can then go up above us straight away, and we can turn the IRS systems to nav. So you can see the first one, we switch to nav, it says on DC, and then it says align. There it goes. The second one, we can switch to nav, it says on DC, and then it should switch to align. Give it a moment, and there it goes, and on DC has stayed on. So that's a surprise to me. So let's see what happens. If we switch status on, that's saying 6 minutes basically until the IRS system is aligned. It uses gyros. Yeah, we're getting an alarm. I imagine it's to do with power supply. So we were running on batteries. Let's go and quickly look down here, looking at the tablet. So this is the first thing I've been caught out by. Ground services, GPU connect. So we've told the guys outside to connect the umbilical to the underneath of the aircraft that provide power. Now on the panel here, we can switch on ground power, and the alarm's gone off. So it was a power issue. So we now have the power being supplied by the ground, not purely by the batteries. Okay, the next thing we will do then is go and switch on the auxiliary power unit. Oh, well, let's go and check overhead first then. Yeah, so the red light has gone off, the on DC light has gone off. So it didn't have sufficient power on batteries to align the IRS system. It's good to know. Next thing we will do then is turn on the APU, the auxiliary power unit. So the auxiliary power unit is the small jet engine in the tail of the aircraft that provides electrical power and compressed air. And the reason for doing that is we can then bleed the air from it to spin the main jet engines up. So we're going to switch the APU to on, and you will see a low oil pressure warning come on. And then you switch it to start and hold it on, and you will see this needle exhaust gas temperature will climb, and you can let go after a few seconds, and it will keep going, and then it will drop back down. And after a few moments of the APU starting up and becoming stable, the light in the middle of the bus transfer will light up. So the bus transfer is our means of dictating where power is being drawn from around the aircraft. So if we've got the APU running, we can pull power from the APU, so we will flick these middle two switches down. So we'll see that. So it's saying here, if we zoom in on this slightly, you can see it says APU gen off bus. So basically it means that the power is available from the APU, but it's off bus at the moment, it's not connected. So we can flick these two switches down, and that means we are using the APU to generate our power now. So if we want to, we can actually go and disconnect the ground power. Yeah, and notice it didn't do anything. That's because when we switch on bus transfer, it automatically disconnects everything else. So we're not actually using ground power anymore. So we could come back to the tablet and we can disconnect. It's a bit, the icon's a bit misleading on this. It kind of says the action to do, which means that you're actually in the opposite state. So if it says connect, it means you're disconnected. Okay, so we have fired up the APU and we've transferred electricity supply to the APU. So the small jet engine in the tail is providing the power for the aircraft at the moment. We can go and do some things up here. So there's the window heats, we can switch those on. We can turn on the probe heats. So these are all, ancillary systems that keep the airplane healthy, basically. We're not going to turn on the hydraulic pumps yet. You wouldn't do that normally until you've pushed back. purely because the control surfaces will start moving and you may have crew on the ground around them that could get injured by them. We can turn on the fuel pumps. So the APU is providing the electricity to do that, to have the pumps running. We got over here the cabin pressurization system. We can tell it what altitude we're going to be flying at. We are going to be flying at 5,000 feet, so we don't have to touch that. You can see over here then, we've got the APU up and running. We can turn on the APU bleed, which will provide the compressed air to spin the turbines on the engines to get them ignited. So if we go and turn the APU bleed on, you can see the duct pressure is climbing, and it will come up to about 40 psi or thereabouts. If we go and turn on the packs, which are the air conditioning packs that, to warm the aircraft, for example, you will see they take some of the duct pressure. If you do that, you won't be able to start the engines. So we have to turn those off to get the pressure back up. And now we can go and start the engines. So if we go and look down in the cabin, it's worth pointing out in the real world, you would have programmed the FMC now, the flight management computer, set up your master control panel, and you would be talking to the ground. So maybe we'll do the flight plan first before we start the engines on, just to do things in a correct kind of order. So the first thing the FMC is telling us is that the nav data is out of date. That's purely my fault because I'm using an old set of Navigraph data. So the Navigraph data is the data about the waypoints, the ILSs, the standard instrument departures, and the standard approach routes. So it's like the computer in the aircraft carries information about, the world. So it's basically telling me that my set of that data isn't up to date based on today's date. So I can just press clear to make that go away. So I don't know what D-Link does. I'm not going to go in there. I'm going to go into FMC, which is the flight management computer. So the general way the FMC works is you have these buttons that guide you through the initial setup. So it's always at the bottom right typically, so we'll follow it through and see where it takes us. POS init, so that's going to take us to setting up the IRS reference location. So when you see square boxes in the FMC, that is a field that needs to be filled out. So to get the initial location, we can go, you can see here there's one of 3 on the pages. So we can go to the next page, and this lists the GPS locations from the GPS units that are on board the aircraft. So we can click one of those. Yeah, it's warning me I haven't done the IRS position. So I've clicked one of those, which has transferred it into the scratch pad. So anything we type on the keypad will go into the scratch pad, and we can clear it back out. So I could clear what I've just done in there, for example, and I could click on it again and it will type it in there for me. Then we can go back to the previous page, and if I click the button next to the field where the boxes are, what I've typed will go into that field. Yeah. So I can put in a reference airport. We are Edwards, so it's KEDW for Edwards Air Force Base. These are the international airport codes. We are at gate 78. Some of these things I've looked up in advance in Little Nav Map just to make sure of the information, so you don't need to worry about that. So if we go and look now, it's saying we need to do the route next, so we'll follow it through. Now, to save us some time, because we put a reference airbase in, it's got the code already in the scratch pad ready for us to put into this page. So the origin airport for our flight, our departure airport is KEDW. We're flying back to the same airport, so we need to key it in again and put it in the destination airport. So KEDW. There it goes. We're not going to touch the company route field because it's this kind of a hack that's built into the X-Plane simulator that there is a folder in the file system. So within your X-Plane folder there is an output folder, and within there there's an FMS plans folder. So if you create a route or a flight plan in Little Nav Map or any other piece of software that can do it and save it as an FMS file and put it in that folder, you can then just type the file name in, put it in that field, and the flight plan will be loaded. Now I don't want to do that because I want to program the flight plan to show you how to do it. So we can invent a flight number. So I'll just put ABC 123. We can put in the runway we're taking off from, so we're going to take off from runway 22 left. We can go to now performance initialization. So it's worth pointing out that these fields that are hyphens are optional. We're going to fill some of them out, some of them we won't. So performance initialization we're going to go to next. So if we click on that, the first field it wants is our gross weight. So if we go and look at the Avitab tablet and go to the home screen, and then go to fuel, weight and balance, and then look in payload, we can see we've got a takeoff weight here, which is £103,000, so 103.002. We want this for the FMC divided by 1,000, so 103.0. Okay, so we go jump over to the FMC, 103.0, and you would have noticed the number changed while we were looking at it. That's because the APU is running and it's burning fuel. Cruise altitude, 5,000 feet. Reserves, how much do we want left over when we land? £3,000 of fuel, please. Cost index, now this relates to a formula that informs the FMC when it's flying with the auto throttle on of how, or even, sorry, if you've got VNAV or the auto throttle, of how aggressively the aircraft can climb, so, or how fast it can accelerate as well. So it's usually, I think it's up to 200 the cost index number can go in a 737. We're going to set it to 50, which is fine. And we can execute that. So all the changes we made so far have been pushed into the system. So now we can go for N1 limit. And so this is controlling the climb performance of the aircraft. We don't need to fiddle with it. We're going to go for the takeoff settings next. So we'll say we want flaps to be 5 degrees. Or, you know, that's what we're going to set the flaps to, and that calculates us the rotation speeds on the runway based on it, or the FMC already knows the takeoff weight, it already knows the flaps, and it also knows the runway, so it knows how long that runway is. So we can say 112, 113, 127. So just by clicking on those, I've transferred over the calculated value into the actual value. Centre of gravity it's asking for. We can find that out from the FMC. So on this fuel, payload and CG page, you can see takeoff weight centre of gravity is 19.9%. So if we go back over to the FMC and type in 19.9 over here, it's then calculated that and told us the trim we need for the elevators is 4.5. So if we go back to the pilot's eye view and look down at the trim wheel here, there's a meter next to it. So it says we want 4.5. So if we roll the trim wheel to 4.5, what this is doing is setting up the trim of the aircraft based on its weight and payload to be correctly configured, and for the flap level to be correctly configured so it's neutral when it accelerates along the runway. If it was not, you could get the nose lifting in the air, for example, and and so you'd potentially not be out of control, but it would, you'd have to be fighting against it on the way down the runway, so it keeps things stable. Okay, so let's carry on looking at the FMC. So the next thing we might look at is the departure. So we already told it what runway we're taking off on. So if we flick down through the pages of runways available, 22 left is already selected. There are no standard instrument departures for Edwards in the system, so we can't choose one. So we don't need to worry about that. So we're pretty much done, but we can carry on programming. We can say, let's go and have a look at our arrival runway. Oh, actually no, it's saying route if we follow the normal route of, the path of setting things up. So carry on with route, and we can see the route, we're on page 1 of 2. So this would be the same as if we clicked on the route button here. So we can shortcut to any of these pages we're seeing. So if we go to the route button, there's page 1 of 2. If we go to the next page, we can put in the list of waypoints we're going to visit throughout our route. So I've got a pre-arranged list ready to go. The first waypoint to do this kind of a 4-pointed circuit around Edwards is called Jaeger, no doubt named after Chuck Yeager. Y-A-Y-G-R. They're always 5 letters, or mostly 5 letters, the waypoints for GPS. So Jaeger is the first one. Then Serut is the next one, C-E-R-U-T. And then we go to Pepsi, P-E-P-S-E, P-E-P-S-E. And then we go to CPIX, C-E-P-I-X. And that's it. Those are the 4 corners of our kind of making a box shape around the airfield. So we activate that. and we execute it, so that inserts it. We don't worry about the cruise altitude issue. So you can see now, in the few minutes we've been talking about things, the IRS system is enabled, so this map has come to life, and we can actually see the flight plan projected onto it now, which is cool. We can actually go to arrival as well, so if we go to the departure arrival button, we can configure now where we're going to land. In the real world you wouldn't necessarily do this straight away. While you're in the air you'd be talking to air traffic control, and they would give you your vectors to landing based on, you know, where the airport is, or if you've got a redirection or anything like that. So but we're just doing a route from A to B, you know, with nothing in the air around us, so we can do this. ILS 23 left, this is where we're landing, and we execute that and we're done. So that's pretty much the flight plan done. The next thing we might do is pushback. At this point we'd go and tell air traffic control that we're ready for pushback, but obviously we don't need to do that. We're not at a gate, we're just out on the tarmac, so we can start our engines right now. So to start the engines we need to have the APU bleed on, we need to have enough pressure to spin them up. So if we now come down here then and we look at the engine starters here on the overhead panel, this is the right engine, this is the left engine. If we turn the right engine to GRD and then look down at the displays down here, you can see the N2 number is climbing for the right hand engine. N2 is the gas turbine speed, and it's the percentage speed of nominal, with nominal being 100%, so it's climbing towards 25% it will slow down at. And the reason for that is it will only accelerate any further if it has fuel. So if we just check overhead while it's accelerating, we have turned the fuel pumps on. So yeah, it's got to 25.8% and it's stopped there. The reason for that is it can only go any faster if it's got fuel, so that's the air pressure driving it round. So there are two levers behind the throttles, the engine starter levers, and they introduce fuel into the engine. So we push this one to idle, and you can see the fuel flow is increased, the N2 number is increasing, the exhaust gas temperature for engine number 2 is increasing, and the N1 number is increasing. So N2 is the gas turbine, N1 is the turbofan, because there's two parts to each engine. There's the gas turbine and the big fan on the front that produces most of the thrust. Okay, so if we go and look back overhead, that you just heard that clunk, that was the engine starter going back to off all on its own, which means we can now start the other engine. So we switch the engine starter to GRD for engine number 1, and you can see N2 is climbing towards 25 for engine number 1. When it gets there, we will advance the starter for engine number 1 to idle. So we just wait for that to happen. 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. Advance the starter to idle. Fuel flow increases immediately, exhaust gas temperature raises, and the N1 number increases. It's worth pointing out I'm not doing the full checklist for this. Before we even started doing anything in the real aircraft, you'd be checking things like the engine fire warnings are working correctly and things like that. But we haven't done any of that. We don't need to worry about it. It does all work in this simulator, I should say. So it's all, you heard that clunk there, that was the starter. Switch up above has gone back to off, so the engines are up and running. So if we go and look back overhead now, we can see on the bus transfer, Gen off bus is showing for the left and the right engine, which means we can provide power from those now and not the APU. So if we transfer power to the engines, that means the engines are now generating electrical power for the aircraft, and that has disabled the APU automatically, or it's switched off the crossfeed from the APU. So now we can turn off the APU bleed and we can turn off the APU. So the small jet engine in the tail is now powering down. The other thing we can do is go and turn on the packs. Yeah. And again, at this point, as before we started the engines, we would have been pushed back, so we're no longer near anybody. We can turn on the hydraulic pumps. Yeah. Or the power to them, so suddenly we'll have control authority, so when we waggle the stick around or move the flaps, they will move now. We can also turn on the yaw damper. I'm not going to get into too much of what a yaw damper does. We can arm the exit lights and close the lid on it, and we're pretty much ready to go. The yaw damper on big planes is to do with induced yaw. So when you use ailerons in a strong manner on a large aircraft, the ailerons causing drag on each side of the plane cause the plane to yaw. So a yaw damper is a mechanical, kind of ingenious mechanical way of stopping that from happening. Okay, so we need to switch on some lights. So anti-collision lights on, strobes on, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so what do we need to do? Next thing to do, just check everything's done down here. We can go and look at the progress page on here and leave it on that page now. We need to set up the master control panel. So this is the master control panel that controls the autopilot. So in order that we don't get any surprises when we get on the runway and when we hit the autopilot, we want this to be pre-configured with everything we can do. Now I've already done most of it. I've set the course, which we won't use to be honest, to be the same direction as the runway. So 225 degrees. I've set the heading to be 225, so if we need to engage heading selection mode in a hurry, we can use it at the drop of a hat. We are going to have to set the indicated airspeed for the auto throttle to use, because we'll put the auto throttle on in speed mode and we'll want it to go for 220 knots immediately after takeoff. So there's our 220 knots. 5,000 feet on the altitude is already done. The vertical speed won't switch on until we're in the air, until the autopilot is actually running. We can turn the flight directors on. So there's two parts to the flight control system on most of these big jets. There's the flight director, which is the computer figuring out what it wants the aeroplane to do to achieve what you've told it to do on the autopilot. So that's the flight director. And when you turn that on, when we're in the air, you'll see it, there'll be a magenta line on this display. When the autopilot's on, the flight director projects what it wants to do to the aircraft. The autopilot obeys the flight director, if that makes any sense. So the autopilot reorients the aircraft to point where the flight director wants it to be. I hope that makes sense for you. Okay, what else do we need to do? I think that's about it. Oh, right, okay, so we've got the engines running, we've got the hydraulics on, we need to move the flaps to takeoff position. So I've got it mapped to a button on my joystick. I've effectively moved the flap lever over there to 5 degrees, and you can see it travelling to 5 degrees. All good. So we're going to come off the parking brake. So parking brake is here. The engines are on idle. You will notice we're already rolling. At idle, most big jets have a positive amount of thrust, enough to make them roll, so you have to be careful of that. To steer the aeroplane on the ground, I'm going to use the tiller. I've got it mapped to an axis on my joystick, so I can control the nose wheel steering via the tiller. This is independent of the rudder pedals, which you can see moving down there, which obviously move the rudder. So on the big jets, the nose wheel is very often completely independent of the rudder. So I'm going to steer the plane. We're not using air traffic control, there's no other traffic around, so we don't need to worry about anything. This is purely a functional test to show you how the aeroplane behaves. You will hopefully see as well that the flight model in X-Plane is vastly superior to Flight Simulator 2020. I mean, Flight Sim 2020 is great fun, and it fakes a lot of the effects you might see, which are wonderful in general aviation aircraft, but once you get to the big jets, it's pretty poor at them. But I understand there's an awful lot of work going on from the likes of PMDG and some of the other famous makers of aircraft to make study level aircraft. There's a couple out already for 2020, like the CRJ, but there's more coming. Okay, so I mean, Aerosoft are making the A320s for 2020 as well. So we're just taxiing down to runway 22 left, or 23 left. I think it's 22 left at Edwards, and then we'll fly our circuit can have a look outside while we're on our way. It's a nice looking simulator, isn't it? It's a little bit more functional than Flight Simulator. Hasn't quite got the gloss, but the benefit of not having the gloss is actually things work and they behave as they would in the real world for the most part. Okay, so we've got the MCP sorted out, we've programmed the route, we've configured the systems, so we're pretty much ready to go. At this point it's stick and rudder time for the pilot. So again, the engines are at auto, they're at idle. They are just providing enough thrust completely automatically to roll down the taxiway on their own. So I'll have to hit the brakes to stop the plane rolling. So we're about to cross a runway. In the real world we would have had to stop short there and ask for permission. But as I said, there's nothing around, so we're good. While we're in flight, we'll have a look at some of the systems. Well, just while we're taxiing along here, it might be worth looking. If we can switch this display to plan mode, we can zoom in, and you will notice on the legs screen you get a step button. So we can step around our flight plan and have a look at it. Bit of a point of interest really, more than anything. So we're going to switch that back to map mode just for while we're flying along so we can see where we're going. See what's coming, because the map mode orients us towards the aircraft direction instead of north, so it's very easy to imagine or to visualize what's happening next. It's worth also pointing out on the MCP panel, although we have set courses, you would only really use courses if you're navigating by radio beacons, and we're not. We're going to be using the GPS. So we're using GPS waypoints. So again, in the real world we would stop at this holding point and inform the tower that we are at the holding point. We're not going to do that because there's nothing around. Turning into a scratched record, aren't I? So it's going to roll out onto the runway and go. So let's centre the view up. Move the mouse out of the way. So full throttle. You will notice you can accelerate beyond 100% on the engines. It's not advisable. I'm just doing it to show you that you can.
V1 rotate.
So there's the rotate. Nose up gently. Gear up. Trim the nose slightly, turn the auto throttle on, go for speed, we want 220 knots, remember, turn the autopilot on, put it into LNAV mode, and we're done.
1000.
We can now raise the flaps. I've let go of the controls now, by the way. So raising the flaps reduces the drag, and you can see the aircraft accelerating out to 220 knots. We will now go for 250 knots. And we'll raise the flaps further so they're not needed anymore, that we're already at 220. So I've not got much fuel in this 737, and you can see it accelerates like nobody's business. So we're now approaching 5,000 feet, the plane's levelling out, and we're good to go. We should start to turn into the first turn very soon. So that was quite a lot of things that happened quickly there on takeoff. We got off the ground, we raised the gear, we switched on the auto throttle, engaged speed mode, which took it to the speed we were asking for, and then immediately switched on the autopilot. Autopilot and auto throttle are independent of each other, by the way. I switched on the autopilot and went for LNAV mode. So LNAV is lateral navigation. That means the plane is going to follow the flight plan, or follow the directions to the waypoints, but not the altitude or the speed. There's also a VNAV mode, which would have taken over from the throttle and the altitude, and we would have had to have programmed everything into the FMC to do with speeds and altitudes. Okay, so it's pretty much sit and monitor the aircraft at this point. So this is where the pilots really do their work, I suppose, of monitoring systems, making sure everything's healthy and getting on with it. So we're in LNAV mode. We can have a look at maybe some of the information. Oh, we never told anybody to put any seatbelts on, did we?
The captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. Please recheck the security of your seatbelt.
We could also, now we're level, I mean, I didn't bother with it. There's a lot of immersive stuff you can do with the PA system in the ZiboMod. So there's all these lovely things like saying hello to the passengers when they get on the plane. Like we could do the captain level off message. So if we do that and go and listen.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, the seatbelt light's off. You're free to move about. Once you are seated, we recommend you keep your belts fastened. Thank you.
So now we are level, we can go and, I mean, this is all cosmetic really. If you were running another piece of software,
closer. Meanwhile, please sit back, relax, enjoy the trip with us.
yeah, if you were running another piece of software alongside the simulator, like there's a wonderful utility or second part of the game really called self-loading cargo. If you're running something like that, that's going to be monitoring exactly what you're doing, and you'll get a report at the end from the passengers. So you'll get a plane full of passengers that you have to manage in midair as well. So you have to look after doing the meals and unruly passengers, making decisions, moving people. So, and then obviously they're going to tell you how well they thought the flight went at the end. It's a fantastic piece of software. So go and have a look for self-loading cargo. I don't actually own it, but I've talked to people who've got it, and they all say it's great fun. Okay, so we're just levelling out and we're on the downwind leg of our circuit. So if we look out the side here, we can see the airfield over there. We can put this back on. Should we have a look at what's in AVI tab while we're en route? So a lot of this is extensions that are specifically for the ZiboMod, like being able to plan your pushback and things like that. But the native functionality, you get things like flight charts, airport information. So we could put in, for example, KEDW while we're in midair, and it would give us the information on the airport. And I think you can you drag this or use the mouse wheel? Yeah, you can drag it. So you can get some basic information, for example. You can search for real-world routes. You can have a look at the map as well. So it'll take a while to start drawing. Here it comes. So it's all clever stuff. So this is using OpenStreetMap, and you can choose where you get the data from. So we could use Mercator if we wanted to, which is using a saved image put in the correct folder in the system. So Little Navmap will help you do that. It's very clever. But we don't need any of that. Come back in the aeroplane. Where are we in the route? So we're now doing 250 knots, we're 5,000 feet, everything's looking good. And we can see now the flight director is now superimposed on the display. So the plane is flying directly towards the crosshair of the flight director, so the autopilot is following it. So there's the base over there. Those are the runways out in the sand. They're famous. Okay, let's just have a look from outside, shall we? Before we get to the next turn. We'll start decelerating when we get to the next turn. So again, it's actually pretty accurate looking, isn't it? It's stunning, really. So something we have to think about before we get anywhere near landing is tuning in the ILS for approach to Edwards, and it's already configured. Look, we've got the nav1 radio down here is on 110.1. So the way you program this, you can tune the integers and the decimals for the radio frequency, and then you can transfer it to become the active frequency, which makes the active frequency the standby frequency. So this is the one the radio is actually tuned into. So if I put 110.1 in, that is the ILS frequency for runway 22 left, or 23 left, sorry, at Edwards. So you can see on the nav radio over here as well, we've also got it tuned in. So something else we would do is go to this standby instrument here and switch this onto approach mode before we get to approach. So this is basically in case these displays go wrong. It's a secondary system using the same information. So when we get onto the ILS, you will see some diamonds. One diamond will appear here, another one will appear here. We'll also change the mode of this display to approach mode, which tailors it specifically for what we need to do. So let's decrease the target speed down to 200 knots now, and we'll let the aeroplane coast down to 200 knots. So you can see the speed is decreasing. You can see a little green arrow there. So that's indicating the speed we will be doing in a number of seconds. I believe it's 6 seconds on the 737. So it tells you what speed you will be doing in 6 seconds time based on what's going on at the moment. So you can see the plane has started its left turn. We're banking over. We're going to stay at 5,000 feet. The ground level around here, actually I haven't programmed, this would be a good example actually, I haven't programmed the barometric pressure. So, oh, and I haven't got a little nav map running either. Can we get the weather? It wasn't on there, was it? I think it's 3002 it should be. So you would look up on your weather report, your METAR report, what the atmospheric pressure is at the destination. So we need to change this from 2992 to 3002, so we can tune this, and you can see the altitude changing. So what's going on there is the altimeter uses atmospheric pressure to read how high you are above the ground. And the ground has obviously an atmospheric pressure that varies with the weather, so you have to tune the altimeter to be accurate. So now you can see that the height on the autopilot is wrong compared to the actual height above the ground, or above sea level. So we could say we actually want to go to 5,000 feet. We're so close to it, it's not going to let us change it. But we could say we want to go to vertical speed mode. So 5,000, yeah, it's not going to let us do it. If we did it 4,900, it will do it, look. And we'll say we'll go down at 250 feet a minute until we get to 5,000 feet. So it's coming back down, look, you can see the vertical speed has changed. Now we're coming into the turn towards the runway. So we are going to slow even further to 180 knots. We're going to go to flaps 1. And you can see a little red marker started to appear high up on the indicated airspeed. So that's at this flaps configuration, that's the maximum speed has appeared. So we'll wait till we're down to 180 knots, and we'll go for flaps 2 now, and it still hasn't appeared. If we go for flaps 5, it will. There we go, look. So the maximum speed for 5 degrees of flaps is 200 knots. So we're in the final turn. We're going to go way down to 150 knots now, because we want to explain things along the way. You can see the diamonds have appeared from the ILS, and we are below the vertical component of the glide slope. While you are below it, you can engage approach mode. So I'll wait until we're fairly straight. So there we go, fairly straight, and we engage approach mode. So there's the runway we're landing on. So approach mode means the autopilot is now going to follow the ILS. Yeah, so it's going to gently go left, hopefully, and follow down to, yeah, you can see this is slowly coming in, and it will start to track downwards as well. So we can drop the gear at this point. We're doing 150 knots. We can start dropping the flaps more. The more we drop the flaps, the more the nose will come down, because the plane doesn't have to have such an angle of attack to maintain 150 knots, which means we get a better view of the ground. So we were flying kind of deliberately slow so I could show you that. So we're now at 15 degrees flaps, so we're going to slowly wind the flaps all the way down. So we'll go reduce to 140 knots now. So I'm going to get the plane stable, and then I'm going to come off autopilot and just fly it in manually to show you. So you can see we're now absolutely on the diamonds. So That basically means in terms of the glide slope, so if you imagine an invisible line from the runway, it extends directly to us. We are on it. If we were above that line, the diamond would fall below the line here. If we were below the line, the diamond would be above the reference line in the middle. If we were to the left of the glide slope, the diamond would slide to the right, meaning we need to go to the right. If we were to the right of the glide slope, the diamond would be over to the left, meaning the glide slope's over there. Does that make sense? So let's actually try that. Let's go and turn off the autopilot and turn off the auto throttle. Warnings go off, we can just click on them to get rid of them. Straighten our view up. So I am now in control of the throttles and the aircraft, so I am moving it around, and I can prove that by moving the stick around. So if we go off to the right, you can see the diamond underneath sliding off to the left, meaning we are off to the right of the glide slope. You can also see the vertical component has gone way down, meaning we're way too high now. So I'm going to dive. I'm cutting the engine as well so we don't accelerate too hard. Gone to full flaps. Wheels are already down. And we're coming back towards the glide slope, so we're watching those diamonds. So we're back on the middle one. And we'll pull the nose up gently to stop our descent being quite so fast. We're increasing the throttle now to stop ourselves slowing down, otherwise we're in danger of stalling. And we fly down the glide slope to the runway basically. One of the nice things here is, even though it's a little bit jerky, you can see the control moving, so you can see me moving the yoke basically,
1,000 feet stabilized, Mr. Burton.
doing very, very small little adjustments to it. We're a little bit slow. You'd be looking for about 130 knots, 135 knots to give yourself a margin over stall speed. So when you hear that whizzing noise, that's the trim. That's me trimming the plane, because the nose was starting to go up because I'm accelerating. So the plane is no longer in equilibrium. It's going faster through the air, the wings are generating more lift, the nose is coming up. You have none of these issues, by the way, in an Airbus. It will pretty much fly itself, so you just point the nose the direction you want it pointed, and it gets on with it. You don't have to trim it as actively as you would, for example, a Boeing.
500.
Or you don't have to trim it at all, to be honest. So we've gone a bit high there, so I'm just going back down towards the diamond on the LS down here. Again, the nose is trying to come up, because obviously putting the nose down accelerates you.
300.
So when we get to about 50 feet, I'll cut the throttles to idle and pull the nose up. And we will stall gently onto the runway. Well, that's the plan. Not actually a stall, it's a controlled loss of lift.
$50, $40,
So idle,
$30, $20, $10.
and we're down. So we can raise the flaps, we can put thrust reversers on if we want. Let's go for thrust reversers. You can see the nose diving for the floor when we hit the thrust reversers. Take the thrust reversers back off.
knots.
And we can use the wheel brakes just gently to slow us down. We're rolling now.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened until the captain has parked the aircraft at the gate and turned off the seatbelt sign. This will be your one and only indication that it's safe for you to get up and
So we're
move
using
about
the
cabin.
nose wheel
Please be
steering now,
reminded to use
not the
caution
rudder,
when opening the overhead
to come off the
bin
runway.
to prevent injury from articles that may
So
have
while we were at
shaped
speed, we
your
were using the rudder to stay straight. As soon as we're going slow enough, we can use the nose wheel steering again.
Electronic devices while we taxi to the gate. However, your laptop computers and larger electronics must remain stowed.
So there you go.
We invite you to visit
A circuit
Delta.com
of
while your future
Edwards
travel
Air Force Base
includes checking in for a flight
in
and managing your SkyMiles account.
X-Plane, in the ZiboMod
ZiboMod
737-800X. So something we might do while we're taxiing back to the gates is to go and turn on the APU again. So we're holding the start down until the exhaust gas temperature for it starts moving. And the reason for doing that is we would want to generate our own power potentially before we are plugged in, or we may not be able to plug in at a gate. We may not have a external power available. So that's given us a backup that we can use the cross feed and switch over, but just before switching the engines off, we could switch the cross feed over to the APU. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I don't think there's any huge point in going through the whole. Whoops, there's a bit of a glitch there in the braking. I don't think there's any much value in taking you through the whole of the power down cycle for the plane, so I'm going to leave it there. So this was, the Zibo 737-800X in X-Plane 11.5, and you could see it's study level. It's very impressive, and it's great fun to operate the aeroplane. So if you have any questions, throw them in the comments. If you want to come flying with me at any point, head to virtualflights.online on the internet, where I help run a website where we hold regular group flights online. So they're twice a week, usually on Wednesday evenings and Saturday afternoons, and there's usually 20-30 people get together and we go and fly airplanes somewhere in the world. Just check out the website, virtualflight.online. Okay, speak to you soon.